not a significant issue. Yeah, you have it, yes, because it's saying you having to go on to get it. Okay. Kyle is not, you are here. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out who is not here. Mary's not here. Karen, you are there, so, oh no, I'm just taking attendance now, so everybody else. Charles, back there. Brandon, I don't see. Robert, okay. Joseph, here. This is here. Here. Okay. All right, so let's continue talking about New York City, which is where we are. So let me get the computer going. Anybody had any questions about, we didn't have any meeting actually, did we? Did I post anything on New York City? I don't remember. Okay. Going with the rest of today, let's try putting the computer on. Okay, so I'm not sure, so we'll continue with New York City. Has everybody been to a hearing at this point, or almost everybody, I think, should have been to their hearing? Anybody have questions or anything interesting tidbits from your hearing that was interesting, fascinating? Yeah.
Well, no, I'm just curious how, I guess I haven't read the syllabus in a couple of weeks, but my hearing was 6-7 hours long and I had to leave early.
Right, so I said that was fine.
Yes,
And there was a delay while I was there, so I wanted to just.
2-3 hours is
Okay.
all you had to stay.
Yeah.
You did not have to stay for all 6.
But it was
so
all about the jail, so
then you picked out a very,
Sure, there's a lot to write about, but I wanna make sure that I could.
whatever you
write
heard
about
is
that.
what you write about.
Okay.
Yes, you do not have to listen to any more, you don't have to attend anymore.
Okay.
So, yeah,
I went to my local village and it was about an hour and a half and.
that's fine too, it is what it is, I mean, we can't make
They
something,
did 4 cases, so we only read about 2 of them.
yeah.
But they didn't hand out, they post online the,
You're right, they have agenda. Under New
But
York.
they won't do it though, they said it takes a couple of weeks for them to put it on, and it's due next week, and I went to July 10th. So the chair said that it may not be online.
The agenda's not online?
No, he said he did.
Interesting. Let me
He has
tell-
to sign off on it.
Let me tell you, but after the meeting, they have to sign off on it?
Yeah,
Well, let me tell you something, they're in violation of New York state law.
Yeah, that's
New
what-
York state law
That's what I said.
amended about more than that, probably 6 or 7 years ago at this point, requires that before an agency discusses an item at a public hearing, so there is an open meetings law in New York. So let's just talk about open meetings law and this as it relates to applications. Many states have, maybe most states have some kind of an open meetings law, which requires that actions of government agencies have to be conducted out in the open. This is to avoid, ethical violations, to put it kind of politely. So that, if something's happening, everybody knows what's going on, that nobody can make an allegation. Both that you can't make an allegation that there was something untoward going on, and also that you concede it all has to be done in front of the public. Now, in New York State, one of those requirements is that, and this is what I said, about 6 or 7 years old, before an agency, when an agency is going to deliberate on an action, the agency has to post its agenda, either online, if that is something it normally does. So not every agency, most these days, most agencies, even local zoning boards, planning boards, etc., post things online. But even where they don't, if they don't post it online, then they have to have it available at the meeting. So if you go to a meeting and there's no agenda or copies of the application, they are in violation.
I had to take notes the whole time, and
Well, you always would have to
I
take
was like,
notes.
because they had no agenda, so I was writing everything down.
That's very interesting.
I'll
What,
give you
where
the
were
link, I'll
you?
give you the link.
Where were you?
Rockville's in Long Island. It's like, you can see like everybody kind of know each other.
Well, yeah, but that's gonna be true in any small town. And by small town, I don't necessarily mean, Rockville Center's a big community, but it is a relatively small town, yeah.
In New York City, we can do the city plan commission as well,
Right.
right?
But there isn't one this week.
No, that went to one, July 8th.
Oh, you went to one?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Isn't that the same one that the jails were discussed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was different than Board of Appeals.
Yeah, the city planning.
The city planning commission was only like 45 minutes.
Wait, the city board of appeals didn't discuss the jails.
I went to July 10th, I went to the Wednesday.
Well, the Wednesday's what you were supposed to go to, the Monday didn't count. Monday wasn't a public hearing,
But it was,
it was a review session.
got it.
So I suggest you listen to the Wednesday one. Because the Monday, right, you're supposed to go to a public hearing. Mondays are review sessions where the staff of the commission presents to the commission the upcoming applications that they're going to be, the upcoming applications in order for the planning board, the planning commission to be apprised of what's going on.
But it was on Wednesdays in New York City, the Board of Standard Appeals.
No, the Board of Standards and Appeals is on Tuesday.
Tomorrow.
It's tomorrow. I don't know if there is a meeting tomorrow or not.
Yeah, there is.
There is? Okay, so there is one.
The public planning, city planning is on Wednesday.
Yes, but there isn't one this week.
Correct.
Wait, there's one tomorrow, no?
The BSA is tomorrow. Okay, BSA, Board of Standards and Appeals, is the Board of Zoning Appeals equivalent. They meet on Tuesdays. City Planning Commission meets on, public hearings are on Wednesdays. There is no City Planning Commission public hearing this week. There is, however, a BSA, apparently there is a BSA meeting tomorrow. So you're going in the afternoon, and hopefully they get to the land use applications early, which they don't. That agenda is online. You can go look it up now. You can get it. It's online. The City Planning Commission agenda is always online. They're very good about posting their agendas. So, should be fun with that.
Anybody know what time, what are the times? You said
10 a.m. tomorrow.
10 a.m.?
Well, the BSA is, no, the BSA, I told you this all, but I will tell you again, the BSA tomorrow in the afternoon. It is all day, but the land use matters, I mean, they're all land use in some way, but you need to go to the afternoon hearing. Now, sometimes, because they continue, they have what they call they have like the 10 o'clock calendar and the 1 o'clock calendar, and if you go to the calendar, it will show you which ones are supposed to happen. But in fact, it doesn't, if they start at 10 o'clock and they don't get to the afternoon ones until 4, it's okay that you're there at 1, as long as there's some applications.
I think right before this class started, some of the fellow classmates realized that the New York, they post all their hearings on YouTube.
Yes,
6 hours long.
I know, I discussed this, it posted on, and what I said was, if you work full-time and you can't go to a hearing, and you live in New York City, and you work in New York City, you can do it, but for those of you, but I prefer that you go, because it's very different to be there. When you went to the hearing on you were at the hearing, when did you watch it?
I was at the hearing.
That was, I'm sorry, was that how it was?
Tapes.
I'm sorry?
No, they were trying to kick like 4 people out because they were interrupting everything.
It's a much more interesting, I mean, it's different being there. So, I mean, if you can't, you can't. Mamaroneck videos, you could go watch me, if you want, but a lot of towns and villages now videotape their meetings.
So can I ask another stupid question?
Just 1 second. Kyle, you're not supposed to email it back to me at the same email address.
I copied all your emails.
Okay. I'm in it now, isn't it? Okay. That's fine then. Yes, sorry.
So which meetings are on YouTube? All of them, or?
The BSA and the Planning Commission are on YouTube, but if you're not working, and I don't know if you do, I don't mean to, if you
Yeah.
don't work, you go see one tomorrow.
Yeah, I do work.
Two quick things.
Yes.
If I'm doing like the YouTube version, where can I find the agenda? Because usually it just like
You have to go look, they post it.
it's somewhere. Okay, and it's the public hearing one or
It
the
is a public
executive
hearing.
session?
No, it is a public
Okay, good.
hearing. Executive session is just the Planning Commission or the BSA, depending on which executive session you're talking about, discussing the applications with the staff.
So that's okay. Got
It's
it.
not a public hearing. You get to
That's
hear
after.
the
In
issues.
case you're like.
I'm sorry?
That's always after.
No, that's before.
So they discuss before and then they have a
Yes,
public.
right.
Yes, they discuss, okay, what are we concerned about? The BSA discusses things like, where are we, what do we think about this, what are the issues, so that the applicant
So they
knows
set the
what to
ground.
address. The city planning commission, it's really the staff telling the commission what's coming up and what's
Got it.
happening.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm looking for my, I had this last week, so let me find, there it is. Okay, so, back to New York City, and let's go back to where we were. So we're talking about the New York City, we talked about the uses, how there are 18 use groups, and that is how you find, and it really has to do with how creative can you be that makes reasonable sense. You know, and when I talk about creative, I'll give you another example. Somebody wrote about the Soho NoHo rezoning in their, read an article, not the Soho, on the Soho NoHo potential rezoning. And one of the issues in Soho NoHo is that you can't have a department store. But there's a Bloomingdale's, I don't know if it's still there. There was a Bloomingdale's. It's still there. Wait a minute. And the way a department store is defined is more than 10,000 square feet. So you say, wait a minute, there's a Bloomingdale's. How does a Bloomingdale's get to be there if you can't have a store? Does anyone know how you get to have a Bloomingdale's there? How creative can you be to come up with why you would have a Bloomingdale's there? Nope, there's no special permit. Remember, there's no special permit, that is a permitted use.
They get the two, they get the two separate spaces.
That's what they did. They said, we have a cash register in the jewelry area, therefore the jewelry department is a separate store. And I don't know what other departments they said were separate. I mean, I don't know which ones they did, but essentially that's what they said.
Well,
Now-
would that be the same case with Nike building their space?
No, Nike is
That
smaller than 10,000 square feet, isn't it?
No, it's not, it's like, it's like 30.
I don't know, I haven't been there, so, where's the Nike?
It's on the corner of Spring, it's the northwest corner of Spring and Broadway. Someone built them 30,000 square feet, and they occupied.
No, Nike wouldn't have been that, my guess is Nike did get some, either,
I think
well,
it was-
are they in the space that used to be Dean and DeLuca?
No, that's Prince Street, and they're still there.
This is like a full building. It's like 4 or 5 stories.
I don't know the answer to the question, but Nike wouldn't have been able to pull that up, I mean, because
This
Nike.
was 4 years ago.
No, I don't mean that's not why. A Bloomingdale's can argue they're separate stores. I'm not sure that Nike can. But maybe, I mean, there's a couple of things. It could have been, it's not a new building, so it could have been in space that was,
It was redeveloped for
Re-
them,
but we developed the interior, or was the building redeveloped?
outside as well.
I don't have an answer to you, for you. I really don't. But they, now there were a couple, they could have gotten, there are some special permits in Soho and NoHo, and there is one particular special permit which doesn't allow, it doesn't allow a change of use, so it couldn't have done that. I don't know the answer to the question. is a simple, let me go back and say that. There are some special permits, a very limited number for certain situations in Soho, NoHo, and they might have gotten a special permit for that, but I don't know. You know, sometimes it depends on how much the city from a policy matter wants to allow. And the problem, of course, with Soho, NoHo is the rezoning doesn't make, the current zoning makes no sense. Because the zoning was adopted, and I wrote some of the original zoning in the early 80s. But the zoning was adopted at a time when, in fact, there were still manufacturing uses in Soho, NoHo. And the purpose of the original Soho, NoHo protections was not to protect artists. Had nothing to do with artists. The original protections in Soho were intended to protect manufacturing uses. That was what the purpose was. The reason why you couldn't do any residential use in Soho, NoHo is like any other manufacturing district because it interferes with manufacturing use, and it's obviously more valuable, and so it's going to push out all the manufacturing. But because Soho, NoHo had these very small spaces, and the garment, which was the biggest industry, garment and some of the other industries that were leaving the city, were leaving Soho, NoHo, where some of them had been located. Artists moved in, and originally the artists that moved in were artists who worked in somebody that needs a manufacturing space, that have manufacturing elevators, that have the kind of elevators, or have floors that can support heavy materials, and elevators that were large enough and strong enough to support heavy materials. And that was the genesis of artists living in Soho, NoHo. Artists and originally they didn't live there. Originally it was artist studios. Okay, so artist studios opened, and then people began to live in their studios. So, but clearly by the early 80s, there were residential use there. And the city adopted New York State amended the multiple dwelling law to allow all the illegal residents to be legalized. Because up until then, they could never have been legalized. But that was the purpose. And there's not a whole lot of artists, actually, and some of those artists became very successful artists. There are very successful artists and some not so successful artists. But the question that I make you think about is, why should we give someone who maybe there's an answer to it? I don't want to discuss this necessarily. But what the Soho NoHo zoning is doing, and what some of the arguments in connection with the proposal to eliminate the artist is, well, but we need to protect artists because artists are poor, and we want artists. Well, I say to you, are artists any more deserving of special treatment than somebody who works at McDonald's? I don't know, I'm raising this, but we are treating them differently. We are saying, if you can call yourself an artist, then you can live in Soho, NoHo when no one else can. So, right? And the argument here is always, well, we have to protect those people from being pushed out, but everybody who has been historically living in Soho, NoHo and has lived there for a good chunk of time is protected. They cannot be pushed out because they're all stabilized. They're stabilized in connection with the New York State amendment of the multiple dwelling law, which made all those tenants, required the owners to get Cs of O, and made them all stabilized tenants. So all of the outcry about we have to protect the artists doesn't make sense. And why are we protecting artists? In large part because, why are we protecting artists? For the reason that we have now got a special permit for hotels in M1 districts, because there's some special interest group that has a vested right and is strong enough in votes, or raises money, or does something. Yeah.
Excuse me, what was that statute that the artists were protected under?
It's Article 7, it's an amendment to the multiple dwelling law, and they don't protect the artists, it protects anyone who was living illegally, right? This is the loft, what people call the loft law. Article 7A of the multiple dwelling law, which established sort of the minimum standards for legal light and air and other conditions. Right, that was the loft law. The loft law was adopted in the early 80s to protect all these tenants, and they are protected. So, okay, so let's go on. So I think we talked about this, and the envelope, all right. So I think this is what we were up to. All right, so what is a special district? We talked about this in the context, and we talked about overlay district. On top of the underlying zoning to change one or more, but not all of the underlying regulations. And the underlying regulations apply except where changed. I will say that in some of the special districts, like in Midtown, which has such extensive provisions, not much is unchanged from the underlying zoning. Now, some special districts are shown on the zoning map, right? They're shown on a zoning map. But that's not enough. So you know that you're in Midtown, right? You know that you're looking at a building in Midtown. It isn't enough to know that you're in Midtown, because Midtown has sub-districts. It has the Midtown East sub-district. It has the special Fifth Avenue sub-district. It has the theater sub-district. It has the Pennsylvania Station, I don't remember what it's called, Pennsylvania Station sub-district. And there might be another one that I'm forgetting. All of those are sub-districts. So if you're on Fifth Avenue, you have different regulations than if you're on 7th Avenue, or 6th Avenue, or 4th, or Lexington Avenue. You're all in the special Midtown district, and those are not mapped. In order to know what sub-district you're in, you have to go to the text of the zoning resolution. So if you're looking at something in a special district, always remember you have to look at the sub-district. You have to look at the zoning resolution, and if, you know, the sub-districts are generally, there's a map that's attached to as an appendix, it's in the zoning resolution, and lots of regulations. So you always need to look at that. Okay. So now, just going through New York City has a series of different types of approvals that you can get in New York City. So, do the next one, hold on, I can't remember, no. So the simplest at the lowest level is a certification. A certification, which you don't see listed here, is not a discretionary application. Doesn't mean it doesn't get reviewed. Most certifications are approved by the chair of the City Planning Commission, not the whole commission, just the chair. There are a couple of certifications that are approved by the commission itself. They are non-discretionary, meaning that if you meet all the standards, and the standards are all sort of either numeric or very, you know, hand in these 3 documents kind of thing, the commission has to approve. It doesn't mean that they don't try and exercise some discretion. Right? Amanda Burden, who was the chair of the former 2 chairs ago of the City Planning Commission, was said to actually trying to redecorate the city with the requirements for plaza. There were a series of requirements for plazas, but if you submitted an application that met all the requirements, but city planning didn't like it, they might suggest that you modify. At the end of the day, if you said no, and you met all the standards, they would have to approve it, or she would have to approve it. It was usually not worth it for an applicant, because it would take longer, the processing would be slower, and the next time the developer needed something from the city, you know, that was sort of like a demerit, oh, you did something bad. So while technically you could have gotten approved, if you had wanted, you could have forced the city to approve it. Yeah.
So certification was like occupancy?
No, we're not talking about anything at the Department of Buildings.
So what kind
A
of?
certification, in order to build a plaza in New York, right, you want a plaza bonus, you have to get a certification from the chair of the City Planning Commission that you have complied with the requirements of the plaza bonus.
Your DOB stamp drawing?
Has nothing to do with DOB. Remember, you're going through city planning before you get to DOB. If I want to get a plaza bonus, right, up until whenever it was, 15, 20 years ago, I just went, maybe more, I just went to DOB, I showed my plans, and that was it. If you want to get a plaza
So what
bonus,
kind of thing, you know, all bonuses, like all
No.
bonuses kind of like that? I mean,
no, that's why I said plaza bonuses. You have to go through, I mean, what else? I'm trying to think of what's another certification, where's another case of certification?
Or affordable housing, HPD certification approval.
It's not certification, that's just a processing, there's no city planning approval. You have to comply with the requirements, and HPD has to approve it, but there's no city planning certification involved in, affordable housing. You show, right, there's nothing in city planning, it's really HPD is making sure that you more than dot your i's and cross your t's, it's that you really don't need to. Another example of a certification process is where you want to transfer, where theaters have the right to transfer historic landmark theaters have the right to transfer floor area to another theater not to another theater, to anywhere, any land, more or less, in the theater sub-district of the special Midtown District. So if I am a theater, right? I own a theater, I'm Schubert or Niederlander or New Jamson or whoever, there's a couple of other theater owners, and I own a theater, and my theater uses 20,000 square feet of my 80,000 square feet that I could build on my zoning lot. I have 60,000 square feet of floor area, and I could take that excess floor area and I could transfer it to, pick a developer who owns a property on 51st Street and 7th Avenue and wants to develop. I could transfer, and there are rules. You have to sign these documents, you have to get this approval, but that's a certification process.
You need
right?
an expediter to know.
No, has nothing to do with an expediter. Expediters don't get involved. Expediters or DOB expediters do not get involved in city planning. The certification for those things that need a in that case, it's a commission certification. It goes before the entire commission, not just the chair. So there's just a handful of things I'd say that this applies to. All right, so now let's go with the other. That are discretionary. So from everything except variances is a city planning commission action, okay? So we've talked about variances, you all know what a variance is, we don't need to talk about it now. I'm gonna talk about the other, know what a rezoning is, and we know about amendments to a zoning ordinance. All of those are discretionary, right? The commission has discretion in approving them. Yeah, Raphael?
I didn't understand when you said everything except variance is what?
Is by the city planning
By
commission.
the city.
Okay, so what we're gonna do, so the two things that are left are these things that city planning issues called special permits and authorizations. They're just different, the difference between the two is the process. And why is it set up? In some places, the zoning resolution calls for special permits, and in some places it calls for authorizations. There are not a lot of authorizations, but there are some. The most significant difference between a special permit and an authorization is a special permit is a ULURP action, and we will talk about ULURP momentarily, and an authorization is a non-ULURP process. Up until about 7 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, I don't know, or probably longer than that, but originally authorizations didn't go to public hearings. An authorization was a kind of a more elaborate review by the City Planning Commission than a certification, and allowed for some discretion. Now, they might have gone to a public hearing, but they didn't go to the City Council. Now, some authorizations go to the City Council. So, just as you're thinking about what you might need in connection with an application, There are different levels of these things. Okay, we're not gonna talk about zoning lots yet, or development rights, or merger, that's coming next. I wanna talk about ULURP. Okay, ULURP, the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure. ULURP is a process. Everybody talks about ULURP as if it's, oh God, that involves ULURP, right? Right, everybody says that, oh my God, I don't wanna deal with ULURP. ULURP is a process. That's what it is. It is a process by which certain actions of the city get approved. The actions that get approved pursuant to ULURP are, there's 15 of them actually. An amendment to the an amendment to the zoning map, right? Down zoning, up zoning, rezonings. Those are all subject to ULURP. Special permits from the City Planning Commission. Now, in New York City, you can also, in certain situations, you can get a special permit from the BSA. Remember, who issues special permits? Either the planning board or a board of appeals, depending on or sometimes the local government, depending on what city, where you are, what the local regulations of the city says. In New York City, and in most cities, where it'll tell you who can issue. Sometimes only one agency can issue, and sometimes certain special permits are issued by the Board of Appeals and certain by the Planning Commission. In many places, when the planning board issues a special permit, that's the end of the deal. In New York City, when the Planning Commission issues a special permit, it is subject to review by the City Council. All right? So, what else? So special permits. Actually, the sale of city-owned land. The city wants to dispose of land, except in certain cases, like a lease wouldn't have to. But a sale of land has to go through ULURP. Some of the awarding of certain monies, grants that are connected with development have to go through ULURP. So a variety of actions have to go through ULURP. And the provisions are set out in Charter 190, in Section 197C of the New York City Charter. That's the rules for ULURP. Now, as a technical matter, an amendment to the to the text of the zoning resolution, not a map amendment, right? Not an amendment changing from an R7 to a C63. That is a ULURP action. But an amendment to the zoning resolution that says in R7 districts you can have manufacturing use, that is not technically a ULURP action. That is under Section 200. As a practical matter, the process is the same. But as a legal matter, it isn't ULURP. Everybody talks about it as if it was ULURP, and there are a couple of small differences, but it is, practically speaking, ULURP.
It being text change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so here's a list of the things. A map of a subdivision, to the extent that you ever did that, a map change, a special permit, a revocable consent. In certain cases, there are certain franchises, rights you get from the city to use your street. So for example, if you wanted to build a bridge across the street, that would need ULURP. Urban renewal plans, disposition of real property. But obviously, we're talking land use and really what we're talking, but it's all the same process, all of that. Okay. So, what is the process? So, the language that's used are pre-ULURP and ULURP. The ULURP process, which I'll talk about, we'll get to, is a statutory, it is a process. It is basically a 5.5 to 6.5 month process and cannot take longer. Can't. So when people complain about ULURP, they're not actually complaining about ULURP. 5.5 to 6.5 months is really not very long. What they're complaining about is the pre-ULURP process, which has no statutory time restrictions. And it is formalized in the sense, and the steps are all on the city planning website, and it is a formalized pre-ULURP review process, formalized probably sometimes starting in the early 2000s. And it has some time frames built in there, but at the sort of time frames where city planning shall endeavor to get comments back within 60 days. Okay, so it took them 4 months or a year. Or, it only applies to a complete application. Well, the whole process is getting the complete application. Bless you. So, it's okay. So, pre-ULURP is where the time that people complain about happens. So the first step in the pre-ULURP process is really talking to city planning and saying, hey, city planning, this is what I want to do. I want to, let's just take this property because we're sitting here. I want to demolish my building, and I want to we're not a landmark, and I want to rezone this property to allow probably have a 15 FAR here already, so an 18 FAR. All right, so probably you'd have 2 actions there. You'd have an amendment to the special district text for the Midtown zoning, and you'd have a rezoning creating, well, actually you wouldn't in the special Midtown district, because all of the FAR is all set out in the text of the special district. So in the Midtown district, if you're in a C6-4 district, which normally might have about 10 FAR, whether or not you have a maximum 10 FAR or not doesn't depend on the fact that you're in a C6-4 district. There's a chart in the special Midtown district and tells you what your as of right FAR is. So merely because you're in a C6-4 district, if you're in Midtown, you don't know what your FAR is. You have to go look at the chart. It's much more complicated. Okay, so you want to rezone this, and I think this is the highest density districts, obviously. Let's assume it's a 15, you want to go to an 8, so you want to rezone the property. So the first action is you're going to call the city planning, and say, hey, city planning, this is what I want to do. And they might, depending on who you are, what the application is, they might say, okay, let's set up a meeting, or they might require you to file something called a pre-application statement, which is essentially the application filing a piece of paper with all of these maps and other things that you get from city websites. Saying, here's my property, here's a copy of the zoning map, here's a copy of the tax map, here's a copy of various other maps, and here's a copy of other information that's available on public websites about this property. So that when you meet with city planning, this preliminary meeting, called an informational meeting, they have an idea about what property is, what it's zoning. It helps them kind of narrow down what they're looking at. So you meet with them.
Is that the first column over there?
That's all the first column, because there's no, right, we're in the first column, we haven't left the first column. Pre-certification.
What does that mean? Okay.
Pre-ULURP is also called pre-certification, because the first formal step of ULURP is certification. This certification is not the same certification that I was talking about a minute ago. Yes, the language is a bit complex. So you meet with the city, you tell them what you want.
Is this before or after the pre-ULURP?
This is all pre-ULURP. Right now, I'm talking about what's called pre-ULURP or pre-certification.
On this?
In this chart, we haven't even gotten to column 1. We're pre-column 1, if you will. We are at here, waiting to get to this.
I have a question regarding the statement you talked about Midtown. You said even though it's a C6-4 zoning, it doesn't necessarily mean it's that FAR. How do you know if it's in a special district?
Special districts are shown on the zoning map. You weren't listening a minute ago. I will repeat it. Special districts are shown on the zoning map. So when you look up the zoning map, and let me go find the zoning map for this but unfortunately it takes a while to go.
I think he gives the arrows. Let's just go back.
Someone, maybe, get it there. Here's
So the grayed
example.
out area, right?
So the grayed out area, right, that's a special district. So you know that we are in half of the site is actually in a C66 district, and half of the site is a C6 4.5. Right, because this building is right here. It's a split lot. But as I said before, as I said earlier, that doesn't mean anything in Midtown. You have to go to the, text of the special Midtown district to see, because there's a chart. You might think, oh, well, I'm in a C66 district, that tells me ABC, what my FAR is. But when you're in a special district, it doesn't tell you anything. Or it might or might not tell you anything. And in Midtown, it tells you nothing.
Okay, so when you're in a gray area, literally the gray area, you know for a fact you have to look at the text, right? That's just
Yes.
rule of thumb?
Good way, rule of thumb, yes.
Okay.
Because even if you're in like the Park Improvement District, the Special Park Improvement District, which is, a strip on the Upper East Side, and it's basically just a height limit and something else, it's an FAR and height limit, there's not much else. You still have to look at it. So yes, if you're in a special district, you need to not just say, oh, I'm in a C66 district, that means my FAR is blank, and you go to the zoning handbook and it tells you what the FAR in a C66 district is. No, it tells you nothing. And even if you knew the FAR, there are other rules, there are many, many other rules that could apply. So for example, in Midtown, there are parts of Midtown, you can't get an inclusionary housing bonus in a 10 FAR district. The only way you can go from a 10 to 12 FAR is by providing on-site recreational use. All right, so you have to go and look to the text. Okay, so going back to pre-EULA. So you meet, they give you, so they might, depending on if it's a controversial, a big area application or a small one, they'll give you some feedback. They may have to, the staff will speak with the chair of the commission. There'll be some internal discussions. They may ask you at that point, even though you haven't done anything else, they may say, what does the community board think about this? And even though you have never spoken to the community board, they might want you to go and get some preliminary feedback from the community board. All right. So you submit, you talk to them, and then you submit some additional information. This is what you want to do. And then one of the things that they do during the pre-EULA process is they do the environmental review. Now, we're not going to talk about what environmental review is. City Environmental Quality Review, SEQRA. People pronounce it SEQR, SEQRA, whichever. The SEQR process happens concurrently with pre-EULA and EULA. SEQR, everybody pronounces it differently. CEQR, City Environmental Quality Review. Yes and no, people pronounce it differently. So that happens during EULA and pre-EULA. And the first step is for the city to determine what's called the reasonable worst case. So what SEQR analyzes, and we'll talk about that, 2 weeks maybe, is what is the impact of the reasonable worst case that you can develop with the approval, whatever that approval is, as against what you could build as of right. So in my example of this building, I'm going from what I think is a 15 FAR to an 18 FAR. The reasonable worst case would be an addition of 3 FAR. It's not building an 18 FAR building. It's the reasonable worst case is a development of 3 FAR. All right?
Why would that be an environmental?
Well, if I think about it. If I'm building a bigger building, what kind of environmental impact might that have?
not only like environmental, like the land, but the surrounding environment.
Well,
like
tell me, what if something's environmental,
projecting shade.
projecting shade,
Right.
And more emissions.
more emissions?
Greater loads on like sewer, water.
All of those things are environmental. Environmental is broader. We're not talking about sort of the narrow environmental, but all of those things are going to be, and many more, are potentially going to be affected by my building a new building. Well, further on, the simple one is subway, streets. Right, Shadow is the big one these days with all of the buildings on 57th Street in the park. You know,
But
big-
does the zoning account for the bulk and massing already? Why?
That's why I'm only, remember, I can build a 15 FAR building. So let's say I could build in this building, how tall is this building? Anyone know how many stories are in it?
11 or 12, I think.
Is that all? Because it's a loft building.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's this day.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot more. It's a building, but let's say this is a 40-story building. I don't know. I'm sorry? Let's assume that I want my new building, I'm gonna build a tall and skinnier building, so now my new building is going to be 800 feet, right? Let's assume this is 400, and I'm gonna build an 800-foot tall building. Some of that 800-foot tall building is just a reconfiguration of the existing floor area. So I can put 15 FAR in my 800-foot tall building. But some of it, I can only put in because I'm seeking a rezoning of a 3 FAR. That's gonna give me a 3 FAR. So there's an impact from that 3 FAR. So the city wants to know, what's the impact? If you built an as-of-right building at a 15 FAR, what would your building look like? If you built a building that we're going to approve with through the ULURP process, if we approve this rezoning, what's the impact from approving this rezoning? What's the impact of building, let's say, an 800-foot tall building instead of a 700-foot tall building? What's the impact of having X thousand additional people on the street that are gonna be located in that an extra 3 FAR of floor space? There's an environmental impact there.
Is this just for the ULURP or this secret?
No, see, we'll talk about SECRA in a couple weeks, but this is when that SECRA process happens. So when we talk about SECRA, you'll understand,
Would it happen similar to like zoning lot mergers?
has nothing to do with that. No, that's an
It's a similar
Sorry.
concept if you're increasing the FAR.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So when you're doing like a zoning lot merger,
An as-of-right action.
which it's the same concept, you're increasing the FAR.
Right, but that's as of right. I'm not going for any approvals from the city in order to do that.
Well, there seems to be some sort of disconnect. You're basically doing the same thing, maybe in different processes.
Well, there's one
increasing
thing, there's two
the
things.
buildable on a certain.
There's
zoning
two
size.
things, there's two things. One, the whole point of an environmental review is when the government makes a decision, and I don't wanna go any more into environmental review because it's complex, we'll talk about it when we talk about environmental review. When the government makes a decision, has it considered the impact of its decision that it doesn't have to make? It's a discretionary decision, so it doesn't have to make this decision. When the government makes a decision, has it considered the impact on the environment, very broadly defined? That's what it's about. In a zoning lot merger, there's no government decision involved. Okay, second thing is, in an as of right, if I'm doing a zoning lot merger, and this is my site, and this is, this is 1 lot, 2 lot, right, so I've got 3 lots, and I'm merging 3 lots, I'm merging 1, 2, 3 lots, right? Let's assume each one is 100 feet in width. I've now got 300 times, let's say they're 100, so that's a 30,000 square foot lot, right? So 30,000 times, let's make the math simple, 10 FAR would give me a 300,000 square foot building. But that's 300,000 square foot building of the whole thing. I own this site, or I own this site, and I want to increase my FAR from 100,000 square feet to 30,000 square feet to 300,000 square feet, just on my site. It's a big difference. I haven't done anything here. These two people can now build to 100,000 square feet each. So now I've got 500,000 square feet. Under a zoning lot merger, I could have only had 300,000 square feet. Okay. The city, you do this in worst case development scenario. The city looks at what could be the worst case that would be built from the city approval. As a result of the city approval, there is negotiation there with city planning. At some point, you'll either get what's called a positive declaration or a negative declaration, which are terms under seeker. We are not discussing them now. And you will either have your environmental reviews either over, bless you, or you have to go through an EIS.
Because the pre-ULURP process doesn't have a statutory time limit, is there any way to accelerate it? Like if you have like deadlines coming up?
You can be more responsive to the city and hope that that works.
Yeah.
But the truth is, there is no way. The best thing I can do is if the city really wants your building, really wants your project. And these days that means you're providing an awful lot of affordable housing. That will help speed it up.
What lobbyists? What's your thoughts on lobbyists?
Lobbyists don't help really at City Planning Commission. Lobbyists are very useful for community board and the city council. No question about it, but they don't really help at the City Planning Commission. That's not where the lobbyists' strengths are, because the lobbyists are political players, and where they really help are where there's politics going on in City Planning Commission. Although there's everything is political, it's not really political in the same way. Okay, so sooner or later, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. I think Columbia, the pre-ULURP took, the Manhattanville rezoning took 4 years. Sooner or later, the environmental review will be complete. Oh, so at some point, you will submit a draft application to city planning. And city planning reviews your draft application and says, I don't like the way you wrote this. Revise it. Submit another draft application. You generally have 2, sometimes 3 draft applications. They're reviewing. How long is it going to take? Again, it depends on how busy they are. At some point, they're satisfied with your application and all your maps and all your attachments, and at some point, they agree that your application is complete. And at that point, and only at that point, they certify the application as complete, and that starts ULURP. So here's the pre-ULURP, no specified time limit. Okay. All right. So now we're certified, and once you're certified, that formally starts ULURP. And what happens next? It goes to the community board. The community board has 60 days to review. There's a proposal in the charter. Those of you who live in New York City and are registered voters in New York City will get to vote on a charter amendment. And those of you, let me repeat, I don't care if there are only local elections, and I don't think there's anything other than local elections this year, but there's a charter amendment. Lots of amendments to the New York City Charter up, right? When the charter is the New York City, essentially the New York City Constitution. You need to vote. So one of the charter amendments would extend the 60 days to 90 days if it's happening over the summer. Because most community boards meet monthly, but over the summer they might only meet once. They might not meet in August. So the proposal is to give the community board an extra 30 days over the summer. Okay? All right, so the community board has 60 days to review. During that 60-day period, every community board has committees. Land use, and among them there are things, usually committees called Land Use Committee, Zoning Committee, ULURP Committee, something with a title that relates to land use or zoning. And the committee, which is usually 8 to 12 members about, they will hold a public hearing, and you as the applicant will go and make a presentation and tell the community board why they should approve what you're doing. It can be a long public hearing, it can be a short public hearing, depending on how much they care about this, what the, you know, and everything else. So you'll have your land use committee, the committee will make a recommendation to go to the full board. The full board will have, doesn't have a public hearing generally on the application. Boards have, every community board has at the very beginning of the board meeting, they have what they call a public meeting where anyone can speak about anything. You know, what do people do? So first you have all the politicians talk about what they've done lately for the community board, and then you have, you know, local groups. I just want to let everybody know that, you know, the Blank Dance Center is holding its festival on, you know, October 23rd. I want everyone to know that we're having it. Any kind of public announcements, and then people who want to complain about something or something else will come, and you as the applicant have 2 minutes, just like everyone else, to make your presentation. Needless to say, in 2 minutes, you don't say a lot. Some places, some community boards, it might be 3 minutes. And then the community board usually takes the recommendation of the committee, right? The committee said, please approve, you know, we committee, land use committee, approve this application. But these days, generally applications are either, there's kind of 3 ways they do it, and usually, in most cases, the community board, the full board, follows the committee. They will either, they could approve or reject the application outright. More often than not these days, I mean, sometimes that happens anyway, they, like the jails, I think Community Board 1 rejected it outright. No, actually, they might have put conditions. Or they approve it with conditions, right? We approve it provided that A, B, C, and D, that the applicant does A, B, C, and D. Provided that the applicant agree that he's going to put landscaping along the property line, that the landscaping he's showing includes trees, that he doesn't do something. We approve it provided that he does or doesn't.
At any point along the process, if you get rejected, you have to start all over.
No, and no. Okay, so the community board, so
I'll wait.
or they reject it. We reject this application unless the applicant decides he's not going to build it, or, you know, agrees that he's going to reduce his height by 150 feet, or whatever it is. Somebody, you asked about the lobbyists. Lobbyists, when you're at the community board, you want the lobbyists there with you. They don't make a presentation, but they're talking to the members of the community board behind the scenes to find out what are really the issues. What can the developer do? And very often, a developer will agree. Doesn't have to agree, because a community board recommendation is purely recommendation. If the community board rejects it, from a legal perspective, that has no impact on what the city planning commission does. It may have great political impact at the end of the day, but the city planning commission can completely ignore a community board recommendation. All right, so, but there's often a lot of, you know, if it's a big project, there will be discussions behind the scenes between the developer through her lobbyist and the community board about what's really the problem for the community board, what can we do?
But you said that the applicant, when they have to present the community board, then makes a recommendation to go to the full board?
Yeah,
When you say the full board, you mean the full?
community board.
Community, okay, so they're not all there when you present?
No, you're only presenting to the committee, the 8 to 12 members. Okay, so,
Would the community benefit agreement, would that be between the subcommittee
Community benefit agreement is not between a government, no government entity is involved in a community benefit agreement. Okay, it's between the developer and some, maybe it's an LLC, a community organization that's an LLC that does it, or some other, but no government entity is involved, in New York at least. In other places, it's not so clear that a government entity can't be involved. I think I mentioned Detroit tried to adopt a law that required community benefit agreement. There's some legal substantive issues as to whether in fact you could, if it's not land use related, but that's all behind the scenes.
That would never be a condition.
It would never be a condition, but all the things that the city, they might want, but right, it would never be a condition, but to sign a community benefits agreement wouldn't, but sometimes a community board might put, because it can say anything it wants, it might put conditions in there that a developer has no obligation because they're not related. Yeah, so community board could say, we're not willing to, we approve this application provided on the condition that the developer, open, no, that would be land use, does something that isn't really a land use subject matter. Usually they have some relation to land use, as we mentioned. Okay, so, sorry?
That'd be more like build a greenhouse on a school roof or something.
Yes, that would be what they might ask for, and the developer, depending on what it is, might write a letter to the community board saying, I agree that I'm gonna do this. Okay, so 60 days, it is a 60 days, but there's one little caveat to all these days. ULURP was adopted in the 70s. In the 70s, if I wanted to send you a copy of my application, I put it in the US mail. There wasn't overnight delivery. There were faster US mail and slower US mail, but it all went by mail. We had to make copies. It was much harder to make copies in the 70s when ULURP was first created. So there are time periods. So there's like 9 days to get the application after it's certified. So if city planning certified something on Monday, applications are certified at review sessions, at Monday review sessions. If an application was certified on Monday, the community board 60 days didn't start Tuesday. It starts I think it's 9 days there. It starts 9 days later. Because the application has to be transmitted. It has to be not just transmitted, but in the 70s, and I was at city planning in the 80s, I mean, these things were put together by hand. You didn't have mass machines that could print out thousands of pages. No, they were done slowly. And a lot of things might be cut and pasted. I mean, literally cutting and pasting. Scotch tape. To get the application, might have scotch tape in it.
Just a little sidebar, so you think that they would adjust
You
the
would think,
time
but they're not.
with technology?
Because you would think.
Process improvements.
Yeah, they don't. Again, because it's like with everything, once you open it up, everything becomes subject to opening up. And I think there was always a little fear. I mean, some of the proposals to amend the ULURP process, all of the proposals that were being considered by the city charter to review the ULURP process essentially made it longer and gave the public a lot more power. So you really, developers don't really want to rock the boat. Yeah, so there's a few days of transmittal that are ridiculous. We all know that. You deal with it. Okay, so 60 days. The 60 days are up. The next is the borough president. The borough president gets to review the application. If the application involves more than one community board, an area-wide rezoning, or something else, let's say, then every board has something called a borough board. The borough board is made up of the chairs of all of the community boards. So the borough board also gets to make a recommendation. So there's 30 days there for the borough president to view it.
30 days?
30 days. Now, these are statutory time periods. That means the city planning commission, when it comes back to city planning, if the community board doesn't get it in with the 30 days, or the borough president doesn't get it in with the 30 days, the 60 days or the 30 days, legally, the city planning commission can't legally consider it. Oh, the community board and the borough president both voted to disapprove this application, and we are gonna, that's significant to us. If it's not within those time frames, they can't, but once they make a recommendation, everybody's aware of it, so. Alright. Goes to then after the borough president's had its 30 days, it goes back to the city planning commission, which holds a public hearing. That's what happens on the Wednesdays, and the one person who went to the jail, obviously you heard that public hearing. I mean, went to the jail, I mean, went to the hearing on the proposed jail rezoning. They have a public hearing. That's a 60-day process. The city planning commission has a 60-day process. And during that, so the first thing they do is they hold a public hearing during the 60 days. Then they make a decision. They vote what they're gonna do with the application, and they vote, and they issue a report, which explains why they did it. Now, applications can be withdrawn, and sometimes people withdraw applications during the process. You realize you thought you did all your homework, but it turns out that everybody hates this application. You might withdraw the application because you're worried that you're gonna be rejected, or there's gonna be so many conditions imposed that you can't, and maybe you'll start the process again to give you additional time to work out some of those issues, because you can't work them out in the short time frame. It rarely happens. Usually you know if there are issues before you get certified, so you've worked everything out ahead of time, but not always.
Let me ask you a question. So for a developer that's submitting a contract.
Contracts don't go through you.
Right, and I'm just,
Oh, you're looking to, yes.
Would they stipulate subject to zoning and
Sometimes,
approval?
that's a negotiation. Sometimes a seller is willing to wait because they know that if it's rezoned or not rezoned, it's gonna affect their price. I mean, I've seen applications where the seller was unwilling to wait, but there was a provision that survived that said if the property is rezoned to allow residential use, then the purchaser owes the seller an additional X dollars. Right, to account for that increased price based on the rezoning. So I've seen you see all kinds of things. Sometimes sellers are not willing to wait because they wanna sell it, and yeah, you wanna rezone it for residential use, but you could have just built a commercial building there. So, depends.
Okay.
It's how risk averse the seller is, how risk averse the purchaser is, and how much flexibility or power they each have.
I guess can you talk a little bit about the dynamic between the pre-application process, for the pre-certification process, and it seems like they're pretty involved with this Department of City Planning before they even submit that certificate, you know what I mean? So, and
During the pre-certification process, I'm gonna so if I have an application.
So point of view is, my question is how much of that is how much of this other stuff is more of a formality versus what gets really worked out beforehand?
I'd say 75% gets worked out beforehand.
Right.
But you don't always know what the public response is.
Right.
And you don't know how strong the public and I worked on an application years ago where city planning, this applied in, the Upper West Side is all urban renewal area. And urban renewal is pursuant to something called a large scale plan, which is like a special district in the zoning resolution. It's not a MAP special district, it's more like a CUP, a plan development. Think of it as a plan development. So, city planning, because a lot of the Upper West Side applications are built back from the street, right? If you go up along Columbus, or in the 90s and the 80s, some of those buildings are built back from the street, and there's all this dead space. So city planning wanted to allow commercial use on the ground floor where it wasn't. So city planning on its own amended the zoning resolution to allow commercial use on the ground floor in some of these buildings where commercial use had not previously been allowed. And they allowed you to modify the large scale plan, which normally is a big process and you need the approval of everybody who's in the large scale plan. They allowed individual property owners to do it. Filed an application to do that. filed the application in accordance with what city planning wanted, right? Exactly what city planning wanted. During the ULURP process, it was clear, notwithstanding that it had gone through pre-ULURP and city planning was fine with this, they filed their application. Once it went to the community board, this application was what's called an authorization, but in this case, the authorization had to go to the community board for review. Right? There was so much outcry from the community board. This is a building on Columbus and 90, I forget what street it is, but there was a health food store in the building. And they were a very nice little health food store, and people loved them. So somebody sat in the Whole Foods that had just been built, and you can see how relevant they got something like 1,000 signatures to oppose allowing them to get this approval, because the fear was that the developer would get rid of this little health food store and raise his rents and put in some other thing. They got more than 1,000 signatures. And the community board, the city planning commission basically said, we didn't realize how much opposition there would be. And so the applicant withdrew their application. They knew there was gonna be a big problem getting approved. So it can happen, even if you think you've worked out things ahead of time, things come up. And you haven't worked it out with the public, you've worked it out with city planning. And while you might have gotten some initial feedback from the public, from the community board, and you certainly would have gotten some initial feedback from the city councilman, woman, person, you don't know the answer. Okay. So, city planning commission approves it. Well, first, if they disapprove it, the disapprovals are final except for map changes, special permits, and urban renewal plans under certain circumstances where they can go to the city council. Okay, it goes to the city council. Or doesn't. Certain actions are automatically reviewed by the city council. Oh, so the difference between a text change and, let's say, and a ULURP action really is the number of days. There is no mandatory 60-day review, no mandatory 30-day review, no mandatory 60-day review. There's no time periods before it gets to the city council. Okay. So.
Just a quick question, but you're saying disapproval except for a map change, but.
No, not except for a map change. What I say, oh yeah, that's what it says there, right? In those cases, it has to go to the city council. Sometimes, certain actions, they're final at city planning. If city planning says no, then they're final, and there's no place to go.
But if you're going for ULURP.
ULURP is just the process.
Right.
This is all ULURP. This is how what ULURP is.
Right.
You're not going for a ULURP.
Well, I'm saying, going through the process, and you get to this point, and you're essentially asking for a map change, because you're asking for a change.
I could be asking for other, I could be asking for a change in the text.
That's true.
I could be asking for lots of things. I showed you at the first, right, there's a whole list.
Yeah.
I could be asking for buying some land. I could be asking for an urban renewal plan. I could be asking for, other things. But anyway, but I said it's final except, but that's only because if city planning disapproves it and the borough president and, this triple no, the community, no, that's the automatic review of something we approve. There's a similar one for a disapproval. There it is. If mayor certifies as necessary, a zoning map, if the mayor certifies. So, doesn't give them any way, it's just got a couple of not final. But it's effectively final because the mayor very rarely certifies anything as necessary.
So, real quick, understand that if it's disapproved,
If
the
you-
mayor can trump that.
The mayor can trump it,
It's like
no
a
one
veto.
else can trump that.
Okay.
Right. Okay, so, zoning, these things are automatically reviewed by the city council in the sense that they have to go to the city council. But a special permit, for example, doesn't have to go to this. If the city council doesn't call it up, then the city planning approval is final. So one of the things you get a lobbyist to do is to, if it's that it's a significant application, you're gonna go to the city council. But if it's a small application, you might be able to not have the city council person review it. Or if it's an application that's sort of consistent with something they had just done. And that's where your lobbyist, again, is gonna help you convince your city council person that it's not necessary to call it up. Why not? Just because it adds a lot more time. And it also adds the ability for the city council person to get something else from you. Every stage in this process is a step in which you want somebody's approval, and right? I want something from you. You might want something from me back. I mean, the something from me back could be very small. Could be, as I said, you know, you have to put landscaping that you weren't otherwise gonna put. It could be as small as that, or it could be significantly more. Okay, so it's a complicated review process, how long they have a certain number of days to call it up, and a certain number of days to not call it up, and if they don't, then it's not called up. If they do, there's a process. But they essentially have 50 days after city planning to review and approve or deny the application. Then there's a process, just like it, remember, the city council is a legislative body. Zoning actions, in many cases, are like legislative actions, so the mayor has a right to veto. There have been very few vetoes of zoning, and the city council has the ability to override it. Right, that is ULURP, and that is the process, the painful process of pre-ULURP.
Do you have any idea what the magnitude of cost to go through ULURP is?
Depending on what it is, and a lot of this is the environmental review, which could be very expensive if you have to do an EIS. I would say 200,000 to $1.5 million. That's how expensive it is.
Always for 2 years and $2 million.
What's the difference?
I've always heard 2 years and $2 million. With like other, you know, there's other, not just, yeah.
Right, it's gonna depend on what the application is for and how big it is. The 2 years is what you would say, nobody didn't ask me, but that's right. City planning, in fact, it said itself at a public hearing on something else that they estimated 2 years to go through to get a special permit approval. Of which 6 months is ULURP and 1.5 years is that whole pre-ULURP process. And the cost varies depending on a couple of things. One, whether your lawyer charges $1,100 an hour or $800 an hour, right? Big difference. Or $1,200 an hour versus $800, right? Big difference, one. A second one is how controversial it is. The more controversial it is, the more things that somebody has to deal with. And then, of course, whether or not there's environmental review. I said 200, probably $250,000 to $2 million might be right. And if it's a big project, I don't know how much the Columbia application cost, but I would say it cost many multiples of that. It was a major application. So any kind of major area, major is gonna cost more. And that would be the fees of attorneys, lobbyists, and the environmental review, which is very expensive if you have to do an EIS. If you don't have to do an EIS, it's not, but if you have to do an EIS, it's very expensive. We're not talking about. Okay, we're done. Any questions on ULURP? Oh, one thing I just want to say. So we have these time periods, but those are maximums, not minimums. Several years ago, 2005, the city rezoned Greenpoint Williamsburg, right? It created all those big waterfront developments, and it did a lot of rezoning in Greenpoint. Now, it rezoned Grand Street, a section of Grand Street in Brooklyn. And the rezoning essentially allowed, I don't remember the FAR increase, but it essentially allowed, this was a street that had a lot of 3- and 4-story buildings. You could build a 12-story building as a result of rezoning. Within a couple of weeks, properties was flipping, were selling, right? All of a sudden, these people could sell properties. The community board got really upset. They didn't expect to have 12-story buildings. They didn't really focus on it. Now it was happening. So they complained to city planning, and the community board. It was a political thing. And city planning decided that it needed to downzone this strip of Grand Street. These dates are approximate, but more or less, this is what happened. the application by the city, because this is true, this process in ULURP is true whether or not the developer is the applicant or the city is the applicant. When the city does an area-wide rezoning, it has to comply with, so when city planning initiates a rezoning, it has to comply with all of this as well. City planning initiated the rezoning. They certified it the day they, right? They like wrote it overnight or whatever it is, it was just a rezoning. Because it was a downzoning, there was no environmental concern, right? They're reducing everything. So it was certified, let's say, on a Monday. The community board, the land use committee, held a public hearing, let's say if there's a 9-day transmittal, it held a public hearing on the 10th day. Held a public hearing, these dates again are approximate, it held a public hearing on the 10th day, and the full board met the same night immediately after the land use committee. So in something like 2 weeks, the community board had already approved this downzoning. The borough president waived their right to review. So at the end of 2 weeks, it was ready, it wasn't 90 days. At the end of 2 weeks, it was ready to come back to city planning. City planning held its public hearing. There's some statutory time notice periods. City planning approved it in less than a month. And so I think from start to finish, it took something like 2.5 months. Why was the city in such a rush?
So no one could rest there.
Exactly. There was an applicant there that was ready to vest. That would have, if it had gone a normal time, it probably could have vested. It complied, since there were no minimums, it went through the process as legally required, but it was able to get it done very fast. And part of the problem is notice. City Planning Commission notice is by the bulletin that it publishes, and it's on the website. It used to be that you used to have to publish in a newspaper, but again, these, as you may or may not know, nobody really reads some of these notices. You have to really read it. The owner of the project that was going to lose, the one that was really affected by this action, found out like the day before the community board hearing, because the community board had posted notices of the hearing like on street poles. We didn't have any advance warning of this, because there's no obligation to give, since it wasn't aimed at a developer, right? It wasn't like it was a read policy matter. So anyway, okay, let's take a break and then we'll come back.